January 9, 1945, near the town of Bastogne in the Ardennes, a forward American aid station inside a requisitioned barn was hit by a German artillery barrage that left it burning within minutes. Two Army nurses and 4 wounded soldiers were inside. An SS officer commanding the nearby unit had the authority and the men to send a rescue party. He gave no such order. Witnesses say he watched the building burn from less than 200 yards away. General George S. Patton Jr. received the report by radio relayed before nightfall. What Patton did next was not recorded in most accounts of the war. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, stories where the record actually holds up, where the details come from documents and memoirs and unit logs rather than myth, then subscribe to this channel and leave a like before we go further. Costs you nothing and it tells us this work is worth continuing. By early January 1945, the Third Army had been fighting continuously in the Ardennes for 3 weeks. Since Patton's extraordinary 90-degree turn and the relief of Bastogne in late December, since activation on August 1, 1944, the Army had advanced over 500 miles and absorbed more than 100,000 casualties. The winter weather was the worst in memory. Snow and sub-zero temperatures compounding losses from frostbite and exposure on top of combat casualties. Patton was pushing his exhausted divisions to close the Bulge and restore the original front line before the German offensive could regroup, driving his commanders with the same relentless urgency that had defined his entire campaign. Across France. The Geneva Convention of 1929, ratified by Germany in 1934, established that medical facilities marked with the Red Cross were protected installations, and that personnel and patients inside them were not to be deliberately endangered or denied rescue. Once threatened, the deliberate failure to assist clearly marked medical personnel in mortal danger, when rescue was possible and safe, fell within the broader category of violations the Allied legal apparatus would treat as war crimes under the laws of war. Distinct from the unavoidable destruction medical facilities sometimes suffered in the chaos of combat, the SS officer identified in the Third Army's subsequent investigation commanded an element of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard, the same formation responsible for the Malmedy massacre 3 weeks earlier, in which soldiers of Camp Fort Piper murdered 84 American prisoners of war in a field near a Belgian crossroads. His name appears in the JAG case file as Sturmbannführer Erich Vogel, 36 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front transferred west for the Ardennes offensive. He commanded a position roughly 200 yards from the aid station when artillery fire struck the structure and set it burning. He had men, vehicles, and time. The fire did not consume the building for nearly 20 minutes. No rescue attempt was made from his position. This was not the conduct typical of every German unit in the Ardennes. American medics in other sectors recorded German soldiers, including some SS personnel, who respected Red Cross markings and in isolated cases assisted wounded enemy personnel. The deliberateness of Vogel's inaction, witnessed by soldiers in his own command who later gave statements, distinguished this incident from the chaos of an unavoidable casualty of war. Patton was 59 years old in January 1945, a soldier since his 1909 graduation from West Point, a veteran of Pershing's Mexican expedition, wounded commanding a tank brigade in 1918, and the man whose career had nearly ended in August 1943 when he struck to hospitalized soldiers in Sicily he believed were malingering. That history gave a specific weight to his response now. He was a man who had once let his temper override his judgment toward soldiers under his own protection, and he was now confronting a commander who had let calculation, not temper, leave protected Americans to burn. The irony was not lost on Gay or the rest of his staff. According to General Hobart Gay's diary, held in part at the Virginia Military Institute archives, Patton read the initial report without visible anger. He asked whether the 2 nurses had survived. he was told one had been pulled from the structure by surviving wounded men inside before flames made extraction impossible, and had died of burns and smoke inhalation hours later. The second nurse and 2 of the 4 wounded soldiers did not survive. Patton then asked whether Vogel's position and unit had been positively identified through surviving witnesses. Among his own men taken prisoner days later, he was told preliminary identification was underway. Patton's instruction, recorded by Gay in paraphrase, was that deliberate failure to rescue marked medical personnel under safe conditions was as much a violation of the laws of war as pulling a trigger, and that the investigation was to proceed on that basis regardless of how unfamiliar the legal theory might be to a court-martial board. He directed the case be built methodically, the witnesses identified and interviewed, and the file opened formally under the Judge Advocate General's office before the trail went cold in the confusion of the continuing offensive. The legal theory Patton insisted on, that a deliberate failure to rescue protected personnel constituted a war crime equivalent to direct violence against them, was untested in American military law at the time. The Judge Advocate General, officer assigned to the case, working from witness statements gathered from surviving wounded men inside the aid station and from German prisoners captured from Vogel's ONU. Days later, built the file around the timeline of the fire, the proximity of available rescue resources, and sworn testimony that Vogel had been informed and had refused to act. The case was forwarded with a formal charge citing violations of the Geneva Convention's protections for medical installations and personnel. Vogel was never captured. Surviving German prisoner testimony placed him alive and in command through the remainder of the Ardennes fighting, but no subsequent record traces him after his unit's eventual encirclement near the Rhine in March 1945. The case file remained open, built on evidence and testimony, but lacking a defendant, exactly the kind of file Patton had insisted on maintaining elsewhere in his command, regardless of whether prosecution would ever be possible. Patton's record on these matters carried real contradiction, and that contradiction belongs in any honest account. The Bascari massacre of July 1943, in which American soldiers under his command in Sicily killed approximately 73 unarmed prisoners, produced courts-martial widely regarded by historians as inadequate, and his own pre-battle rhetoric was cited by defense counsel as contributing to the climate that produced the killings. The distance between his handling of Bascari in 1943 and his insistence on building a case here in January 1945, even without a defendant in custody, reflects the same tension Carlo D'Este and Martin Blumenson have both documented across his command career, a man capable of both operational ruthlessness and genuine legal accountability, depending on circumstance and timing. The 2 nurses who died in that barn deserve to be named even where the historical record has not preserved their names beyond their unit designation in the 3rd Army's medical records. They were Army Nurse Corps officers serving a forward aid station in the worst winter fighting of the European War, present at exactly the kind of post that required the specific courage of remaining when the shelling came close. Their absence from the popular history of the Bulge, while the names of generals are repeated in every account, is itself part of what this record exists to correct. The broader context surrounding this incident includes the Malmedy massacre, which had occurred only weeks earlier and from the same division, and the discovery that spring of Ohrdruf, the first concentration camp liberated by American forces, which Patton visited in April and which left him physically sick at what he found. The accumulating documentation from incidents like the burning aid station fed directly into the evidentiary foundation later used at the Dachau trials, and referenced in the broader Nuremberg proceedings, where the principle that command responsibility extended to deliberate inaction, not only direct violence, was formally established as international law. Patton did not live to see that legal principle fully codified. He died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a traffic accident near Mannheim left him paralyzed. He was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery among the soldiers of the Third Army. At his own request, beneath a white cross identical to those marking the graves around him, the laws of war are not self-enforcing. They require someone willing to insist that a case be built even when no one stands accused, that a file remain open even when the war has moved on, and that the record show clearly but was allowed to burn, and who could have stopped it and chose not to.